Now, with the so-called new dawn breaking, President Ramaphosa will be appointing an advisory unit in his offices. Well, the Policy and Research Services Unit will advise the presidency on how to implement economic and investment policies. All very complicated and a very important job. It's going to be headed by Busani Ngcaweni. For more on this, I'm joined by Professor Alan Hirsch from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at UCT. Mr. Hirsch, a very good evening to you. Thank you indeed for your time in speaking to us tonight. Take me through what this unit is actually supposed to be doing. It's all very complicated. Fancy title.
Well, the way I understand it, Gareth, is that this is going to be something like the unit which existed under President Mbeki and Motlanthe, which was dissolved in the Zuma era. The idea of it is to try to coordinate policy and to analyze and to advise the president, the deputy president, and the minister in the presidency on how to respond to different policy issues, especially where there are conflicts. The president's reduced the number of departments from about 36 to about 28, but there's still a lot of silo kind of work where people aren't coordinating effectively, where there's competition or conflict or differences of opinion because the stakeholders of different departments are pulling them in different directions. So it's a key role. I think the way I understand it, it's definitely broader than economic policy. The way that I was in the policy unit in the Mbeki and Motlanthe areas, and the way that we were structured was to have groups looking at the justice and safety area, the international relations, social policy, economic policy, and the infrastructure departments. So it may be similar, it may not be exactly the same, but there's a lot of work to do.
Professor Hirsch, I know you mentioned the Mbeki era, you mentioned the Motlanthe era when they had this sort of unit in place. On my reading, and please, Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, this wasn't the case. It wasn't in place during what we'll call the President Zuma years. Is that correct? And if so, why was that?
Well, one of the reasons, I can't tell you exactly why it was dismantled, but I think that the fact that the head of the unit, Joel Nchitenje, was closely associated with former President Mbeki, in fact, was on his ticket in the Polokwane conference competition, which they lost. I think that was a factor. I think that Zuma must have seen the unit as a Mbeki creature and wanted to replace it. Now, he did replace it. He replaced it with what was then called the Department of Policy Monitoring and Evaluation, Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, which was had some of the functions of the policy unit, but it wasn't exactly the same, and it's become a different kind of an institution. But it does overlap in terms of what seems to be the functions of the new policy unit. So one of the questions I don't know the answer to is, will the two continue to exist side by side or not?
And for the average South African, Professor, watching you and I discuss this unit this evening, are we going to see anything tangible from the Ramaphosa government in, say, the next 2-3 years from an advisory unit like this? Or does it all happen behind closed doors and we hear about it ahead of the next elections?
Well, it happens behind closed doors, but one would hope to see a more coherent approach to policy than has been the case in the past, even in the first Ramaphosa government, where you have situations, for example, the Department of Home Affairs pulling one way in immigration policy, the Department of Tourism and Trade and Industry pulling another way, and no resolution of the issue. Similarly, you just had a story about SAA. The SAA former chief executive talked about how the Treasury was pulling one way and the Department of Public Enterprises and probably the Department of Transport were pulling another way. That's the kind of thing that behind closed doors the policy unit should be able to help to address by working with the senior officials in those departments and advising the president.
When it comes to trying to pull together all the various strings that keeps a government coordination very much in play, this can take months or years. If the president, for example, Professor, was listening to you speak tonight, and he had to pick one priority to look at for the next, say, medium term, what is that priority if you were advising the presidency tonight?
Well, I think the biggest challenge in the short term, is getting Eskom right. Eskom's huge debt, which doesn't seem to be resolved. The Eskom CEO recently resigned. He didn't feel that he had the tools to deal with the job or the support to deal with it. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty, and that's having all kinds of repercussions. Today, the Purchasing Managers Index indicated that purchasing managers expect lower sales in the next period than before. So things, really need to turn around economically, and I think that they need some sort of certainty about where Eskom is going in the short term and in the medium term in the first place. The other state-owned enterprises as well. And then to resolve some of those other policy conflicts that I mentioned that should be relatively easy to address with a strongly led presidency.
Professor, it's a huge pleasure speaking to you this evening from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at UCT. It's Professor Alan Hirsch talking to us about President Ramaphosa's advisory unit, the appointing of a new advisory unit in his office. As we wait to see what comes out of that particular conglomerate now.